We can now bring in Ian Reifowitz, SUNY Distinguished Professor of History at SUNY Empire State University. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. What does it mean for the Democratic establishment if Abdul El-Sayed comes out on top in Michigan?
We don't want to draw too much from one race. Looks like El-Sayed will win by about 1 percentage point. There's a third candidate, Mallory McNaughton, who is also on the more establishment side, who's, even though she dropped out of the race, is going to get 4% of the vote. Would all of her vote have gone to Stevens? Maybe not, but at least I think a majority of her vote would have gone to Stevens. It would be really interesting to see what would have happened if her name was not on the ballot. So you're really talking about a roughly 50-50 edge. You've got a state in Michigan, on the one hand, which is a swing state, a very important state that is very reflective of sort of the median state between Democrats and Republicans in the general election. On the other hand, it is also the most heavily Muslim state in America. So it's a state that is particularly feasible for a candidate such as Mr. El-Sayed, who has the strongly, let's say, more pro-Palestinian and more anti-Israeli government views than the sort of more establishment candidate like Stevens. So on the one hand, it's a bit of a one-off. Either way, this is an almost even race between El-Sayed and Stevens. It certainly tells us that at the statewide level, these kinds of progressive candidates, when you have a strong candidate like El-Sayed, are competitive. Very competitive. And a candidate like that may or may not be able to be as likely to win in November against a Republican than a more establishment candidate.
So I wanted to ask you about that, looking to the fact that this race is quite tight. What does it mean when we look towards the midterms? Because that was one of the arguments the Democratic establishment had, that El-Sayed cannot beat the Republican candidate down the line.
Right. I mean, you can look at polls. If you look at a number of different polls, it looks like that Haley Stevens might be a couple of percentage points stronger in general, not 10, not 15, maybe on average 2 or 3, or even 1 or 2. But of course, 2 years ago, Mike Rogers, who's now the Republican nominee, lost to the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate by about 0.3%. So talking about Alyssa Slotkin, again, a more establishment candidate, beat Mike Rogers by 0.3%. So if Stevens is 2 points stronger, even 1 point stronger, that could make all the difference in November. Having said that, looking at the polls heading, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to ask you about the voice of progressives within the Democratic Party, because we have seen that the leadership has been reluctant to embrace figures like Zoran Mamdani in New York. So will they listen to what people like El-Sayed have to say if he does come out on top?
I think that you've seen the establishment move somewhat. Okay, you have one of the candidates for president is Rahm Emanuel, who is as establishment as it gets. He was Barack Obama's chief of staff. He was mayor of Chicago. He has long been a staunchly pro-Israel candidate. He gave a speech a few weeks ago in Israel in which he strongly criticized Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He doesn't go anywhere near as far as El-Sayed, but he said that U.S. aid for Israel has to be, it can't be unconditional any longer. It has to be conditioned on Israel doing X, Y, and Z. That statement, I think, tells you that the establishment is moving and has moved. So is El-Sayed going to become the mainstream? Is El-Sayed's position on Israel going to become the mainstream position among Democrats? No. But the establishment position is moving in that direction, away from the Trumpist position, although where Donald Trump lands on any given day is an open question. But it's moving away from the traditional position of more unconditional aid to Israel that you had certainly in the pre-Biden era, and even to some degree in the Biden era.
Because this Senate primary, from what I understand, was one of the most expensive in the United States. Why do you think that various groups spent about $70 million backing Haley Stevens?
Right. Well, one of the groups backing Haley Stevens with a lot of money is AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which backs candidates in both parties who they see as the most, strongly pro-Israel. That's an oversimplification. They want to make sure that their candidate wins, and in this case, it looks like their candidate is going to lose. In other cases, they've won. Last night In Missouri, you have a House race where former Representative Cori Bush, who was defeated 2 years ago by Wesley Bell, who is the more mainstream candidate. Cori Bush is on the same page as Abdul El-Sayed in terms of Israel positions. She lost again this time in her attempt to come back, and so the AIPAC candidate there was successful. It's a mixed record. Certainly, in places like New York City, where Zohran Mamdani won, those are more blue, more strongly Democratic districts, and there the AIPAC-backed candidates have not done as well. But Michigan is a statewide race, and so there you have a serious example of an AIPAC-backed candidate losing, looks like falling short by a point or two.
And a final question, I just want to ask, if Abdul El-Sayed does make it through, what is Donald Trump going to do when he, when he has to deal with all these progressives? Is he going to paint all of them with the same brush, saying they're radicals, they're communists, even though El-Sayed doesn't, he's a progressive, but he's not a democratic socialist?
Donald Trump's going to do what Donald Trump has long done. We've already seen him talk about Democrats as communists because of a handful of Democratic Socialist nominees. I don't think there's any question he's going to talk about El-Sayed as a communist, whatever El-Sayed calls himself, it doesn't matter. He's going to talk about him as somebody who hates Israel, even if El-Sayed makes clear he doesn't necessarily hate Israel. His views are far to the left on this issue, but Donald Trump is going to use his views to paint all Democrats with the same brush, no question.
But do you think Republicans, also the fact that he's a Muslim candidate, will try and say he's going to bring Sharia law to Michigan, even though I've seen videos of him dancing around to Taylor Swift's music? I mean, he seems like a very progressive guy in his thinking, what have you.
He appears to me to be a fairly secular person, but that will not stop Donald Trump. We've seen what Donald Trump has done for going on 10 years now. I wrote a book on it, on his rhetoric. He will paint El-Sayed as an extremist, both in terms of politics and in terms of religion, irrespective of the facts. That's not going to stop Donald Trump. It hasn't for 10 years.
Ian Reifowitz, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on the program today.